Around 1:35 p.m. on June 2, 2023, patrol officers arrived at a home in the quaint community of Hyattsville, a suburb outside of Washington, D.C. A concerned relative had called requesting a wellness check on his elderly aunt. A woman answered the door and invited the police to search the residence. When the officers walked down the steps of the basement, they were hit with the discernible smell of death. Then they noticed various cutting tools and several wet trash bags. This routine welfare check had quickly turned into a crime scene. Who was this victim, and who was the monster who had attempted to hide her corpse? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I'm your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I explore cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Hyattsville, Maryland is a small, quiet urban suburb outside the sprawling, hectic capital of D.C., with only around 21,000 residents as of the 2020 census. Although quaint and safe in comparison, the crime rate there is still significantly higher than the rest of the country. The chance of becoming a victim of violence is 1 in 103, which is 3 times the national average. Compared to the rest of the state of Maryland, though, it is an escape from the danger and chaos of the big city, and is viewed as a haven of peace for many community members. Inside one's family's home, though, the most shocking and vile of crimes would shatter this facade. When officers arrived at a home on the 200 block of Hill Road for a preliminary wellness check, they were met by Candace Craig, the woman's daughter. She informed the police that her mother had gone missing earlier that same year and back in 2022, so there was no real cause for any concern. However, law enforcement officers noticed that the woman's vehicle was parked in the driveway. Several days passed before officers returned to the residence. On June 2, 2023, when patrol officers returned to the home of Margaret Craig, Candace Craig answered the door once again, and this time she invited the police in to search the home. When the officers walked down the steps of the basement, they were hit with the most putrid and overwhelming of smells. When officers looked around the room, they noticed knives, cutting tools, cleaning supplies, and the cover to a chainsaw. In a larger section of the basement, one of the officers noticed 3 to 4 white trash bags that appeared to be wet. They also observed a grease-like fluid all over the floor. When officers asked Candace Craig if she had spilled something, she said it must have been one of her daughters. A small knife was located on the ground, which was captured on the police body cam. It was noted that upon returning later to the basement, detectives found that the knife was gone. The room reeked of decaying flesh. Officers immediately called in homicide and crime scene evidence units. Within minutes, this routine welfare check had turned into a homicide investigation. When detectives arrived at the scene, they immediately observed that the floor was blood-spattered near the group of white trash bags. There also appeared to be human tissue. One of the trash bags was slightly open, and when they peered inside, they saw what looked like brain matter. The other trash bags contained unrecognizable, mutilated body parts. Officers located several potential sources of dismemberment inside the basement. There were several cutting tools and a chainsaw that was bloody and still covered with human remains. Investigators and crime scene analysts at the residence were overwhelmed by the sights and smells they encountered. I can only imagine that the environment was so disgusting that it could have been pulled straight out of a gruesome B horror film. The remains were later identified as 71-year-old Margaret Craig's. Although her autopsy report was difficult to pinpoint an exact cause of death due to her being dismembered, it was believed the woman had died from strangulation. 44-year-old mother of three Candace Craig, along with her daughter, 19-year-old Celia Hardy, were immediately taken into custody and interviewed by homicide investigators. During that time, Candace Craig shared information with detectives that led them to view her as the only suspect. However, there are no details regarding their interrogation sessions with Candace Craig. Presented with the overwhelming amount of physical evidence and given her interviews, the state prosecutor promptly issued charges of murder. Candace Craig faced charges of first and second-degree murder, tampering of evidence, and disposal of a body in an unauthorized location. This last charge specifically refers to the improper or unauthorized handling of a dead person's body or their remains. It includes the concealment and interference with a corpse. Her daughter, 19-year-old Celia Hardy, was charged with being an accessory after the fact. Both mother and daughter were held in the custody of the Department of Corrections for almost 2 years before they went to trial. Soon after, 19-year-old Celia Hardy was taken into custody and charged as an accessory to murder. The young woman decided to share the horrible events she had been forced to be a part of. It was also soon realized that Celia Hardy was suffering from some developmental disabilities, and out of Candace's 3 daughters, this made her especially vulnerable to being made her accomplice. Her lack of cognitive development made her susceptible to manipulation and control, and Celia abided by whatever her mother asked her to do. However, it was obvious to the police and the prosecutor that Celia Hardy was not okay with what she had done, and she recognized that what had happened to her grandmother was something her mother needed to pay for. She admitted to her role in the crime and pleaded guilty to her involvement. The prosecution from the Prince George County State Attorney's Office asked Celia Hardy 3 questions in court regarding her involvement. Did Grandma kill herself? To which Celia replied, no. Did Grandma pass peacefully in her sleep? Celia stated again, no. And did you kill Grandma? Celia once again said, no. Celia Hardy stated to the court that the only reason she decided to be completely honest with the police about helping to dismember her grandmother was because she didn't think she would be held criminally liable for her role. The young woman was then placed back into her handcuffs and escorted from the courtroom. Celia Hardy remained in custody until her mother's murder trial a few months later. Beginning on October 30th, 2024, the jury in courtroom listened to the appalling, grotesque, and horror movie-like details of the crime committed by Candace Craig and her daughter Celia Hardy over 8 horrific days. According to the prosecution's star witness, the now 21-year-old Celia Hardy, the defendant's daughter and accomplice after the fact, the following sequence of events occurred beginning the night of May 23rd, 2023. That evening, Celia overheard an argument between her mother and grandmother. It was over money that her grandmother accused her mother of stealing. Candace Craig had been caught using her mother's credit and debit cards, and her mother would not allow her to steal from her. Grandmother accused her of theft and threatened to report her to the police. The argument escalated, and then suddenly Celia heard her grandmother scream, and then there was only silence. When asked what that sound was, her mother told her something had fallen in the basement. She instructed her to stay out of her grandmother's bedroom, not giving her any further reason. So Leo Hardy did as she was asked because that is what she did when her mother told her to do something. She blindly obeyed. But Celia knew something was not right. The next day, alone inside the house, Celia went against her mother's wishes and slowly opened her grandmother's bedroom door. Her grandmother's deceased body was lying inside a blue bin with a trash bag over her head. Celia confronted her mother about the nightmare she had discovered, but her mother never revealed to her what had happened that led to her grandmother's death. All she said was that they had to figure out the best way to get rid of her DNA. Specifically, according to Celia Hardy, Candace told her daughter, "We have to get rid of Grandma's body by," and I quote, "using acid, burning the body, or chopping it up." Candace Craig opted to chop up and then burn her mother's body. The next day, she purchased a chainsaw on Amazon and began the unimaginably grotesque process. The specifics as to how she dismembered her mother's body are not known. Given the tool she elected to employ was a chainsaw, I can only imagine the absolute bloodbath the act generated. It took the mother and daughter several days to dismember 71-year-old Margaret Craig. Celia Hardy watched as her mother dismembered her grandmother with a chainsaw. She witnessed the horrifying scene of her mother holding and carrying her grandmother's cut-up body parts. 4 days after Margaret Craig was murdered, Candace Craig and her daughter began to burn pieces of the body on top of their charcoal grill. They attempted to conceal the smell of burning human flesh by cooking pieces of chicken right alongside it. However, since Candace Craig ignorantly and dangerously used gasoline instead of lighter fluid, this barbecue quickly burned out of control, igniting a massive fire in the grill. Neighbors watched from their windows a huge blaze erupt from Candace Craig's backyard and ran over to help extinguish the fire. The fire department was called, and Candace explained how she had been grilling chicken when the barbecue caught on fire. Somehow, Margaret Craig's grilled body parts were not discovered during this incident. According to Celia Hardy, she and her mother waited until her grandmother's remains cooled off enough before bringing them back into the house the following day. Since the burning of her mother's body had not solved the problem at hand, Candace was now left with bags of rotting body parts. After this beyond grotesque and disturbing method of getting rid of her mother's DNA backfired on her, Candace Craig just left the body parts inside the trash bags. They sat there in the basement, continuing to decay and stink up the house. It is unknown if she ever had a set plan concerning where she would dispose of the body parts. During her testimony, Celia Hardy was asked why she assisted her mother in these horrific crimes, to which she answered matter-of-factly, "Because my mother asked me." The nephew of the victim, David Wilson, who was the one who had contacted the police concerning the welfare of his aunt, took the stand for the prosecution. David affectionately referred to Margaret Craig as his Auntie Joyce. He shared with the courtroom how he and his aunt frequently talked on the phone in the evenings and would often chat on Facebook, discussing topics covered on MSNBC. He tried not to panic when he couldn't get a hold of his aunt, but then he had a dream that something terrible had happened to her. 2 days before officers would discover the horrific crime scene inside Margaret Craig's basement, David Wilson went to her house to look for his aunt. No one would answer the door, but eventually someone did, and he looked around the house. He even went out into the backyard, worrying she may have wandered off somewhere. As he searched the yard, he observed a large fire stain near the woods and took a video of it with his phone. When he talked to Candace Craig about where her mother was, he said he knew. She was lying. Jillian Filbert, who was the daughter of one of the victim's cousins, also testified to her strange experience at Margaret Craig's residence following her disappearance. She had walked into the basement concerned that maybe she had hurt herself falling down the steps, as she had done so in recent weeks. While down there, Jillian noticed a foul odor and saw several trash bags. She also mentioned to the court how the house, in particular the basement, was trashed. Jillian could feel the eyes of Candace and Celia upon her while she was there, and decided abruptly she needed to leave. The assistant state prosecutor pointed to the fact that during her interrogations with law enforcement, Candace Craig claimed that her daughters were the ones who murdered her mother, not her. This only further helped to paint Candace Craig as a monster who viciously attacked and asphyxiated her elderly mother, forced her mentally challenged daughter to help cut up and dispose of the body, and then attempted to blame her and her sisters for it all. The prosecution passed around the most graphic and disturbing photos to the jury as evidence of what Candace Craig had done to her mother's body. Pictures of the grilled body parts of a 71-year-old grandmother were presented to the shocked and appalled courtroom. Candace Craig's defense counsel did their best to place seeds of doubt into the jurors' minds. They brought up the possibility of other potential suspects living in the residence and questioned the legitimacy of her daughter Celia Hardy's statements. Her defense attorney also brought up the strange circumstances surrounding the grill fire, asking the jury how it was possible that the neighbors who helped put out the fire never noticed the body parts on top of the grill. However, nothing could erase the horrific, grotesquely detailed testimony that was provided by the accomplice to Candace Craig's crimes. Besides, what in the world would her daughter Celia Hardy have to gain by placing the blame on her mother and admitting her involvement when she was mentally incapable of manipulating the situation in her favor? There was nothing that Candace Craig's defense counsel could do to change the impression of their client and the images of her elderly victim that were now seared into the jury's mind. Celia Hardy's cooperation and testimony were absolutely critical to securing a win for the prosecution. The judge recognized what this young woman had been forced to participate in, given her developmental disability, and thus her vulnerability to being manipulated by her mother. Judge Karen Mason granted Celia Hardy a penalty of supervised probation for 5 years. It was acknowledged that Celia Hardy had been in jail since she and her mother were initially arrested for murder, since June 2023. For more than 500 days, this mentally challenged young woman, who had no previous criminal history, sat in custody because she couldn't say no to her mother. What does this say about Celia Hardy's relationship with her mother? It's impossible to deny that Celia was emotionally manipulated by her mother. Her mother was so desperate and turned to her daughter, who was the most vulnerable of her children, to being controlled, to assist her in the most disgusting and disturbing of tasks imaginable. This mother exposed her daughter to her grandmother's dead body.
She forced Celia to participate in the dismemberment and then the burning of her grandmother's mutilated corpse. For this reason alone, Candace Craig is a despicable excuse for a mother. However, during Celia Hardy's testimony, she mentioned how her mother had asked her to look out for her sisters if she ended up going to jail. This at least conveyed some degree of love and concern for her daughter's welfare. There is no information regarding her two sisters, which leads me to believe they are minors and that Celia Hardy was the oldest. There are no words to convey the trauma Celia Hardy experienced by being a part of her mother's crimes. I can only hope that someone in her family recognizes this and gets this young woman counseling and therapy to process and begin to heal from what she saw and did. For less than an hour, the jury deliberated and returned with guilty verdicts on all charges. Candace Craig, 46 years old, was convicted of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and the disposal of a body in an unauthorized location. A few months after she was found guilty on all charges, Candace Craig was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the state of Maryland, this is the harshest punishment possible, since it is not a death row state. In addition to life imprisonment, she was given 3 years for tampering with evidence and 1 year for the disposal of a body in an unauthorized location. To discuss the criminality of the offender, Candace Craig, it is first important to discuss the type of homicide she committed. I have discussed this particular kind of family murder before, so I did my best to find research that was particularly relevant to this specific case. For those of you who are not familiar with the crime of parricide, this is homicide defined as the act of someone killing their parent or parents, although technically the term encompasses the murder of a close relative. To discuss this case, parricide will only include the killing of one's biological parents. On average, this kind of homicide only comprises 2% or less every year, and has remained interestingly consistent since the 1970s, when the study of parricide first began. For contextual perspective, in 2005, there were 14,680 known victims of homicide. Of these victims, 123 were identified as mothers, and 118 were fathers who were murdered by their children. This equates to approximately 2% of all homicide cases. Offenders of parricide can be young or adult, male or female, biologically related or adopted. A comprehensive analysis of the data reveals that, very similar to most offenders of homicide, they tend to be young, white, middle-class males. The murder of one's father is known as patricide, while the killing of one's mother is referred to as matricide. Matricide is usually less common than patricide, and females killing their mothers is the rarest, with daughters under the age of 18 years old being the most infrequent kind of offender. More than 40 years of research from various parts of the world have concluded that female-perpetuated parricide is extremely rare. Specifically, an analysis of the literature showed that daughters killing either parent is very uncommon throughout the United States, England, Canada, Scotland, France, and Japan. These countries were included in studies because they have comparable rates of parricide. Although it is the most infrequent type of offender-victim relationship in homicides, it is still substantially higher than some may believe. One study that analyzed the data between 1976 to 1999 found that of the 5,588 individuals who were arrested for parricide, daughters were the offenders in 16% of the cases, involving the killing of one's mother, and 13% who killed their father. These percentages have remained relatively stable throughout the decades, and not 1 year or 1 decade from the next has shown a huge fluctuation. The vast majority of individuals who murder one or both of their parents are adults. Studies show that between 15 and 17% of offenders of matricide are younger than 18 years old. Similar to many other studies conducted on homicide offenders, the research on females who kill their mothers is very limited. When they are included in studies, it is often minimal in the number of cases included. It is done in a broader study of parricide, or they don't even separate adolescents from adult offenders. One particular case done in England had interesting results that I found to be particularly relevant to Candace Craig's case. It involved 14 females who had killed their mothers and 3 who had slain their fathers. Now, out of all 17 women, it was reported that they lived in very isolated conditions. 12 of the female offenders were single, 3 were divorced or widowed, and the other 2 were married. 12 out of the 14 women who murdered their mothers were middle-aged or close to, and lived with their elderly mothers at the time of the crime. Except for one of these relationships, all daughter-mother relationships had experienced personal conflict for several years, based on issues of codependency and underlying emotions of resentment. All 12 were diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, with 6 suffering from schizophrenia, 5 with psychotic depression, 2 with personality disorders, and 1 with substance abuse. Depression was also noted as being a substantial presence in 8 of these offenders. Based on her extensive research and analysis of professional and legal literature, Hyde, a licensed mental health professional with over 30 years of experience, established 3 typologies of parricide offenders in the early 1990s. These typologies were created to help understand the motivation behind the act of family murder. The first is the severely abused child, who, as described, is a child who has long suffered from abuse at the hands of one or both of their parents. Out of fear or desperation, this individual can no longer deal with the abuse, and they turn to violence. These offenders are almost always a child or juvenile. The second type is the severely mentally ill offender. This mental illness may or may not have been officially diagnosed, but it tends to be a long-standing mental health condition. Adults predominantly make up this category. One psychiatric study conducted in England found that 67% of the perpetrators of parricide were diagnosed with a mental illness, with 1/3 of them having schizophrenia or another delusional disorder. The third typology is the dangerously antisocial type. This type of offender is the perpetrator who murders their parents for personal gain. It may come in the form of financial or even personal freedom. This kind of killer can be an adolescent or an adult. Offenders younger than 18 would likely be diagnosed with conduct disorder, whereas an adult would have antisocial personality disorder. A fourth typology was established in 2013 that introduced the enraged parricide offender, who is triggered by long-term child-parent conflict, fueled by alcohol and or drug abuse, and potentially following a pattern of historic abuse. Based on these typologies and her known motivation that led to the killing of her mother, Candace Craig would likely be identified as a dangerously antisocial type of offender. However, there is such little known about this woman, other than that she and her 3 daughters lived with, and were at least to some extent, dependent upon her mother. There is very little information as to who Candace Craig was at all. Was she unemployed and living completely off her mother's retirement, or were she or any of her daughters helping with the bills? Was she struggling with substance abuse, in addition to an undiagnosed mental health disorder? Was she a victim of physical or mental abuse by someone in her life as a child, as an adult, or maybe both? What were the dynamics of her relationship with her mother? I don't see any record of her defense attorney suggesting either one of these, but we also know how spread thin and less invested, if not outright incompetent, many public defenders can be. Since the data is severely limited and pigeonholed towards young male white offenders, it is important to view Candace Craig's behavior through the broader lens of female criminality, specifically women who kill. Her actions, from the method used to murder her mother to the horrifying and gruesome ways in which she attempted to get rid of her body, goes against the grain of a typical female homicide offender. Research has shown that the primary motivations behind females who commit murder are self-defense, jealousy, or are related to factors of economics, whether for survival or personal gain. Women tend to shoot, stab, or utilize methods like poisoning to kill their victims. The mutilation and dismemberment of the victims of female killers is also extremely rare. Research shows us that female offenders, in terms of motivations, dismemberment, and/or mutilation, and the level of organization, differ widely from those of their male counterparts. The relationship between victim and offender appears to be the opposite, with the vast majority of women who dismember or mutilate their victims having had an intimate relationship with the individual. Not intimate in a sexual or romantic way necessarily, but their victims were close to them in some capacity, compared to most male offenders who engaged in dismemberment or mutilation of their victims, who were strangers. Females who participated in it post-death involved people they knew very well. Whereas men appear to be predominantly motivated by sadism or sexual fantasy that leads them to the dismemberment or mutilation, female offenders are highly organized. Their approach to dismemberment has been identified as being defensive, with the main goal of getting rid of the evidence. It is extremely rare for them to participate in the mutilation of the body for their own pleasure. Rather, it is used as a means to an end. Now, what I find to be so bizarre and very revealing of her mental state is how Candace Craig did very little to hide what she had done to her mother's body after the extreme actions she had gone to in an attempt to get rid of the DNA. After mutilating her mother's corpse, Candace Craig and her daughter Celia attempted to grill part of the remains. As we already know, this plan quickly spiraled out of control and led to an overwhelming fire that caused unwanted attention from both her neighbors and subsequently the fire department. Neighbors helped to extinguish the fire, yet no one noticed anything odd on the grill, like something resembling part of a human, and not just the chicken they placed there in an attempt to cover the smell. What about the horrifying stench of her burning flesh left behind? There's just something not right or even believable about this situation, as aforementioned by her defense attorney. No one called the police to report this bizarre incident beyond the fire? There are elements surrounding this case that just don't add up. I am not suggesting a cover-up or that anyone other than Candace Craig and her daughter Celia Hardy were involved, but the investigation leads to questions that remain unanswered. When the police arrived at her door, Candace Craig could have refused to let them enter her home without a warrant. To the best of my legal knowledge of law enforcement, even if they had smelled something rancid floating up from the basement, this does not constitute an exigent circumstance. Exigent circumstances can provide officers with an exception to the rules established by search and seizure laws, such as a fire, drugs observed in plain sight, or someone making alarming sounds inside a residence. The police didn't even smell anything until after she let them inside, and then she let them go down into the basement, so I wonder why she allowed them entry to search. Her behavior does not reflect a highly calculated and organized offender. To me, Candace Craig's actions are a strong indicator of her severely impaired mental state. I would suggest that by the time the police became involved, she had psychologically dissociated from the crime altogether. Why would anyone dismember someone with a chainsaw of all tools and then leave all the evidence in their basement? Her actions expressed that she barely held any semblance of sanity during or after the murder. The body parts sat there decomposing for several days afterwards, just filling up the residence with the vile scent of a rotting corpse. She made no attempts to dispose of the bags. Then, when officers show up at the door for the second time, she just lets them walk right into the house and enter the basement, knowing full well the horrors they would encounter. Candace Craig was not a highly intelligent psychopath who murdered her mother and discreetly covered up the crime. It would be too easy to call Candace Craig an evil monster and close the case, which is exactly what the prosecution and the media did. In the words of Assistant State Attorney Shauna Coleman, she described the crime committed like a real-life nightmare, expressing to the press, and I quote, "This happens in movies and books, not in real life. The fact she would do this to her own children, her own mother, is beyond the realm of words." To me, her actions are indicative of her severe mental illness. How could it not be obvious to all involved in the investigation that she felt desperate for one reason or another and mentally snapped? No one who can be described as rational or mentally stable is going to go to the lengths of dismemberment Candace Craig went to get rid of her mother's DNA and then leave it out in the open for law enforcement to easily discover. Does that sound like a smart, evil woman to you? It sounds to me like after the crime began, she didn't know how to end the nightmare she had created. And after using a chainsaw to dismember her own mother and attempting to grill her, whatever was barely holding her together psychologically was now gone. This woman was a 40-something African-American single mother of 3 girls. So she was a marginalized offender in addition to her victim being marginalized. I can't help but notice the lack of details surrounding her life. Based on similar cases in the media, when either the offender and or the victim was white, especially a white woman, this story would have had mass media coverage. But it does not. It barely made a whisper outside the county where it took place. This is not to express sympathy for the offender on any level, and there is absolutely nothing Candace Craig could have experienced in her life that could condone her crimes. However, the point of criminology is to understand the elements of an individual's life that may have triggered the violence with the ultimate goal of preventing it. It is a fact that there is no information regarding who Candace Craig was at all, except that she committed fraud using her mother's credit cards. Her mother was not by any means wealthy, so it's not as if she was living in luxury, secretly stealing from her for years. So why was she stealing from her? Was she supporting a drug habit? Was she struggling to find work? Or was she unemployed by choice and chose to leech off and steal from her mother? Was she suffering from a mental health disorder? What were her circumstances in life? To understand her motivations and comprehend what could have led her to snap as she did, these factors of her existence are important. Without them, she is just a monster with a face, but without a story to know and learn from. What are your thoughts on this horrifying, disturbing tale of family murder? Do you think Candace Craig is just a heartless woman who committed matricide in cold blood? Or was she mentally ill? Was she psychotic, suffering for some kind of break? Do you think Celia Hardy should have been sent to prison for her role in the crime? Or had she suffered enough? Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please make sure that you are followed or subscribed on your platform of choice.
And if at all possible, on Spotify or on Apple, if you could please rate the show. All you have to do is go to the About tab and you can rate from there. Thank you so much again for being my listeners. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, by Stereo Code.